Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the EvoPodcast, the podcast where we discuss all things to do with VCE, study habits, and high performance. I'm Dilitha, the head of biology at Evo Academics.
And I'm Sachin, head of chemistry at Evo.
Now, the topic of today's podcast will be the biggest mistakes that high achieving students make.
In today's episode, we're going to be covering 6 points. Firstly, why the confidence that high achievers have often works against them. Secondly, how neat notes don't always equal higher scores. And then thirdly, why leaving exam preparation till November alone is a losing strategy. In addition, we're going to be covering why often doing easy questions might seem good, but doesn't work in the long run, and why reviewing mistakes takes skill and actually requires practice. And finally, why chasing perfection is often worse than seeking incremental progress. So Dilitha, let's talk about confidence, or rather, overconfidence. Now, there are 3 big areas I think high achievers are often overconfident or show that characteristic. First of all, they often seek the notes of past high achieving students, thinking that it will make their scores inflate. Secondly, they often ignore exam preparation micro skills, such as mark allocations or checklists, thinking it's not relevant right now. And thirdly, they often don't accept feedback from teachers or from examiners' reports, thinking that they know it all. So let's try and break down each of these characteristics. First of all, when students seek notes from past high achievers, I think there's an inherent bias of authority. They think just because someone else has found a method that works for them, they can replicate that and get the exact same score. I think where this falls apart is people think it's the notes that build confidence. They think it's the notes that build competence. It's actually the process of making those notes. And I think what these students often don't realize is when you borrow someone else's materials, you're taking their way of thinking and their thought patterns and trying to make it work for you, which is a losing strategy, right? So what I wish everyone understands is that in order to truly understand a topic, there is no alternative to doing the grunt work yourself and making your own notes and building understanding in the process. Also, I think built into that is the idea that somehow there's an easy way to build off someone else's work, which rarely ever happens. So to anyone trying to get high achievers' notes and think that they'll do well in the process, just a word of caution from us. Secondly, I think leaving exam micro skills till November is a very risky strategy. Students often hear their teachers talking about command verbs, list versus explain versus state versus discuss. And they think, I'll do that when the time is right. When they're writing responses, they often focus on writing long, elaborate answers rather than thinking what they can actually do in an exam time frame. And I think this can hurt, especially high achievers, because we all know that there are those 2-mark questions on exams which separate the best students. But that requires paying attention to mark allocations. That requires actually paying attention to the small detail that separates us from everyone else. So on this point, those small skills that we often think are insignificant are actually very crucial and valuable in the long run. And then finally, I think a big area where students often exercise overconfidence is an inability to take and receive feedback. I've noticed that with a lot of my friends, especially in year 12, especially the ones who are talented, right? Very smart, very gifted. They don't take teacher feedback very well. They'll often read the red ink on the sack and they'll go, my teacher was harsh, they were unfair, and I know the answer, right? Likewise, when reading examiners' reports, I think this is even more stark. I think a lot of students go, oh, this answer, I got it wrong, but it's a very niche question and I don't need to worry about it, right? So the reason this is problematic is because when you're trying to get feedback, it's so rare that you take it from anywhere that you can get it. Are your friends going to correct you? Well, you need to have a pretty good source of friends if they're going to correct you every mistake. Are your parents or your siblings going to pick up on these mistakes? No. So who's going to pick up your blind spots? It's the teachers, it's the examiners, and we need the humility to take their advice. So to avoid overconfidence, especially with high achievers, I think it's super important to make sure that we listen to feedback wherever we can get it and never think that we know it all or that we're above anyone else who's trying to give us friendly advice to improve.
So Sachin, it was really interesting that you brought up the idea of note-taking and how some students seek out notes from their peers and older graduates, things like that. That leads into another thing that I've commonly noticed with high achievers, and that's usually the over-prioritization of having neat aesthetic notes. Now, what some of these high-achieving students do is that they end up spending hours and hours and hours of their time writing down and drawing out these beautiful summaries, beautiful diagrams, highlighting things, having very aesthetic titles, drawing these beautiful diagrams of different cells, organelles, whatever, for biology, right? And they feel like they've been really productive, right? Because they've put in a lot of effort, they've spent a lot of time doing it, and it was tiring for them, right? So they're like, okay, I've studied, I've been productive, I've done my work. But the thing is, when the SACs roll around or the end of year exam rolls around, they find that their score didn't actually correlate to the amount of time they put in. Now, the reason this is because at the end of the day, your SACs and exams aren't graded on how nice your handwriting is. Yes, it needs to be legible, but as long as the assessor can read it, you can get the marks, right? The main focus of the SACs and exams is to check whether you as a student have understand the content to a level that is deep enough where you can apply it to unfamiliar situations and trickier application questions. So these students who focus purely on the note-taking, they're simply just procrastinating, what I like to say productive procrastination. They're procrastinating spending time on those more higher yield activities, which are things like doing practice questions, correcting them, reflecting on them, things like flashcards, and things like teaching other people around you about certain topics. Now, me personally, that's what I did when I was in VCE. So when I was in year 11 with my younger brother, who's 3 years younger than me, I'd literally just I'd tell him to sit down in the seat, and then I'll just teach him like transcription, or I'll teach him about the immune response, right? Now, this is a great skill I'd recommend this to all my students to do. Why? Well, it's because the person you're teaching it to has no idea about biology or chemistry or whatever, right? So you've got to find someone who doesn't know anything, right? So don't do it with your mate from your chem class. Find, I don't know, your mum, your dad, your sibling, your grandparents, whoever, right? Someone who doesn't know much about the topic. And then simply by attempting to teach it to them, you're forced to have to simplify the topic into easily digestible chunks for someone who's unfamiliar with it to understand it. So if you're capable of doing that, that means you understand it well. So you keep rinsing and repeating that process until you can teach it to someone comfortably. So skills like that, techniques like that, are much more valuable than just spending time note-taking. So get the note-taking out of the way really quickly. Do it to a solid standard, of course, but get it out of the way quickly and then move on to those active forms of study.
Delita, another thing I've noticed is students often just copy notes off the whiteboard, or they copy what their teacher tells them, but often it's very passive. There's no actual processing going on. What do you make of that as a strategy?
Yeah, great question, Sachin. And even in my classes that I run for bio, that's a common thing that I notice at the start of the year. While I'm teaching, the students are just frantically writing down every single word that comes out of my mouth. And what I tell them in those moments is just, hold on a minute. The main focus, or the main way you should approach this, is before class, do a bit of pre-reading, right? So read about the topic, because you know what's coming up, right? You know, okay, this lesson is going to be on enzymes, this lesson is going to be on gene expression. So do a bit of pre-reading, so you're exposed to the fundamental things. You already know the simple concepts, because you can grasp that pretty easily just by watching a 5-minute video on Khan Academy. So you come to class prepared, and then during class time, you're not frantically trying to write down all these really fundamental things. You can instead spend that time actively listening to what your teacher is going through or what's in your textbook, and really focus on deeply understanding the bits that you didn't understand from pre-reading, right? And those are the things that you can then write down, right? So that means that during your bio period at school, you're not just in your notebook, just head down, just writing every word that comes out of your teacher's mouth. You're instead actively listening. What is new here? What didn't I understand before that I do now? And then you add that into your notes.
So Delita, we're now going to cover why ignoring exam conditions until it's too late is a very important trap to avoid. First of all, I noticed that students often ignore exam conditions either because they think it's not important or the date is too far away, or quite honestly, it's uncomfortable. And I think a lot of people ignore assessment conditions because, quite frankly, they'll realize that they're not as smart as they think they are and that they actually have a lot to improve. So let's get down into why being exam ready is so important. First of all, I think practicing under pressure and under time conditions in particular uncovers blind spots, right? So we all know like high achieving students are very meticulous, writing, perfect answers, consolidating the theory. Sometimes if we don't know the answer to a question, we want to go back and find where exactly did we go wrong and refer to our textbook or our notes. Sometimes it's important to just embrace that uncertainty and go, okay, this is it. How am I going to answer the question with these doubts, with this uncertainty? And I think what that often builds is, number one, strategies to overcome times when you're not exactly sure, but also tells you what you're lacking and it makes it more prominent. So you remember, I actually don't know this. I need to go back and fix it. So pressure, especially time pressure, can help you uncover blind spots. Secondly is what I like to call improvise, adapt, and overcome. Now, I have a very personal experience with this, which is what I feel served me very well during my VCE. First of all, I think as high achievers, we all know that we want to gain the maximum number of marks possible. Hitting the highest score is important, getting questions correct and getting all marks is a top priority. There will unfortunately be times where we are all out of our depth. We prepare, but the test conditions or the scenarios thrown at us are completely left field. In these situations, I find high achievers are often black and white. If they can't get the top marks, then they're just like, well, I didn't prepare for this. I can't, score as well. I guess I'll just be happy with a mediocre score. What's really important with adapting to exam conditions is making the most of the situation, even if it doesn't work in your favor. And this is where we need to know how to cut losses. I had a personal experience doing Special Maths in 2021 for VCE, and anyone who's familiar with that paper will know Exam 2, Calc Active, is one of the worst exams ever written, right? Students came out of that exam crying. I
Yep.
personally left around 6 pages blank, okay, didn't even get to attempt them. The exam was horrendously difficult. On results day, I noticed that I actually outperformed one of my close friends who's currently doing uni maths. And he was doing high-level maths while in year 12. Now, am I smarter than that friend? No, I'm absolutely not. But I knew how to make most of the exam situation. On the exam, I was going, okay, I don't know how to answer this question, so how can I get marks? Maybe if the question mentions acceleration, I can write A equals a certain number, and I'll get 1 mark for that. Maybe if it's a probability question, I don't know how to solve it, but I know it's this particular type of probability, so let me write that down. Again, making the most of the situation. Improvise, adapt, and overcome is such an important skill to have. And finally, building exam rituals. I think this is something which a lot of high performers do, but don't speak about, either because they implicitly do it, or they don't, want to share it. But I think it's super helpful. There are a number of things that puts our brain into exam-ready mode. For example, certain decisions that you might not think are, voluntary, should actually be purposeful decisions. For example, before exam day, how much sleep do you get? Do you use screens on the morning of your exam, or does that distract you? Do you prefer to flick through your notes before a SAC or exam, or do you prefer to just go in with a fresh mind? When everyone's outside frantically discussing, oh, are you prepared? Did you cover this? Did you cover that? Do you like to engage in that discussion, or do you prefer to stand alone? When you enter the exam hall, do you have a particular way you set your stationery on the table and some breathing to help calm you down? Everyone will probably think, oh, this is a bit of woo-woo, like how's that going to affect my score? But the point is it breeds familiarity. Assessments are tough, right? They're uncertain. So in any way that we can get control, I think it's super important that we take that avenue. So building those pre-exam rituals can help us feel much more relaxed and help us perform at our best.
Now, just fleshing out the idea of exam conditions a bit more, another common thing that I've seen lots of high achieving students do is put off doing harder questions until much later in the year. So they keep sticking to the easy questions, the simple, straightforward ones like, oh, define the process, outline the steps of this or that. And they keep repeating, rinsing and repeating those questions. Now, why do these students do this in the first place? Well, it's because getting questions right feels good, right? You've applied your knowledge to a question and you've gotten the marks. So you're like, okay, good, I understand this topic. And there's that sort of underlying fear that students have that, okay, if I try these really hard questions, I'm going to tank my confidence and I'm not going to enjoy the subject. I won't want to study anymore. But the reality is, at the end of the day, you have to do those harder questions because that's what's going to come across, that's what you're going to come across on SAC day and definitely in the VCAR exams, right? So my advice for all students would be to categorize all the questions that you're doing, right? So think of it as easy, medium, hard, okay? So the easy questions are the very straightforward, like definition questions. So you're just defining a certain word or a certain concept, certain process, or you're just outlining the steps of, let's say, for the sake of bio, let's say transcription, translation. What are the steps of it? Those questions are very easy. Why? Because you know the steps, you're just regurgitating them on the page, right? There's not much thinking involved. You're just recalling information. Now, the medium level questions are, I'll talk specifically about bio here in terms of examples. The medium difficulty questions are ones where it's a scenario that you have been exposed to before. So it might be specifically in the study design, but there's a bit of thinking involved, right? So the situation's slightly convoluted. You've got to read the background information carefully to get to your answer. That would be medium. And then hard questions, this is what truly differentiates the highest performing students from the rest of the pack. These are the questions where it's a completely unseen scenario. So it's not in your textbook, it wasn't specifically taught to you at school, but it is related to the study design dot points that you expected to know. Now, with these situations, what's expected is you need to be able to apply your knowledge to that unfamiliar scenario in order to get the marks, right? And that's the hardest level. Now, in terms of how a student should structure their allocation of time to these different difficulties, when you're first learning a topic, you should be doing those easy questions, right? Because that's how you know, okay, I get the fundamentals. But that process shouldn't take too long. After you know, okay, I'm confident, then you need to rapidly move on to the medium and hard level questions, because that's where you're truly pushing yourself and you're trying to see, okay, where are my weak points? So overall, main thing for students to focus on, don't just do easy questions, spread the load across all of them, focus a lot on those medium and really hard style questions. And that sort of leads on to the next point, which I believe you're going to talk a bit more about, which is about reviewing and reflecting, which may especially be useful for some of those medium and hard level questions that we're talking about.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Dalitha. In a previous episode, we've talked about the importance of reviewing mistakes and why that's so important. And I think people should watch that episode if they want to understand the why. This is more focused on how do we actually review mistakes properly. So first of all, I think it's important to get the right mindset, right? First of all, we need to see mistakes as an opportunity to learn. I think a lot of high achievers have this mentality around, I am successful. I don't make mistakes. I'm competent. Yeah. And the problem with that self-identity is it doesn't allow for any flexibility with the real world. We are human. We will make mistakes. There will be someone smarter than us. We will be out of our depth. So I think a better self-identity to have that's more flexible is I will try my best. I am going to make mistakes, but I will learn from those mistakes and not make them twice. So number one, opportunity. Number two, I think urgency. So a lot of people are like, okay, I'm comfortable making mistakes, but you don't want to become very comfortable with this idea, right? Making mistakes hurts. And so then you want to have the urgency to quickly note it down on the notes app of your phone. Or the minute a teacher offers you some advice, don't just say, I'll remember it. Note it down on a piece of paper or in your notes. Have that urgency. And finally, we've talked about this earlier, humility, right? Understanding you don't know it all. You have room to improve, and taking the advice from others, particular seniors, is super, super important to that mindset of fixing mistakes. Secondly, I think reviewing mistakes after that then requires an understanding of why did I actually make the mistake? So a lot of students now go, okay, on my SAC, if I just write the solution in red ink or circle the part that I got wrong, I'm reviewing my mistakes. It's like, yes, that's the bare minimum. But we also need to focus on why did we make the mistake in the first place? And this actually requires mental effort, right? Backtracking our steps to a SAC we maybe did 7 days ago, or to a practice question we even did an hour ago, requires some thinking. Did I misread units? Did I misread a command verb in the term? Was I trying to look at a diagram, but I kind of had no idea what I was doing and just scattering my eyes? What was the reason? And the reason why picking up the source of the mistake is important is a lot of people parrot the idea doing more practice questions equals better performance. Yeah. We've spoken about why that's not true, because if you keep making the same mistakes, you'll keep doing that on the new practice questions. So it's about really drilling into what is the underlying reason and not feeling bad about spending time. It is energy intensive, but it pays huge dividends in the long run. And then the final point I want to mention is something that's actually particularly close to me, because I've noticed this with a lot of chem students. High achievers know the content well, right? They study, they put in effort. That's not their problem. It's about getting those marks reflected on SACs and exams. A lot of these students I find aren't very good at picking up patterns. For example, they know they got a question on a SAC wrong. They'll delve into why they got it wrong, and they'll write the right answer on that. So then they'll go, the next time I see this question, I'll know exactly what to do. The problem is, how likely is it that you'll actually see that same question again? So rather than picking up the mistake on that question, figure out what is the style of the question? What's the theme? What's the pattern? Some examples for chemistry are, anytime a question says, what's the problem with replacing this electrode or using another electrolyte? The answer is almost always, it's a stronger oxidant or reductant, which will interfere with the reaction. Have you been taught about iron in a diaphragm cell? Probably not. Have you been taught about replacing a calcium electrolyte in a random cell? No. So you haven't seen the situations before, but the pattern remains. Likewise, limiting excess calculations. How do we know it's limiting excess? Because we're given the mass of 2 reactants. Or finally, I guess, rates of reaction versus Le Chatelier's principle in equilibrium. How do we distinguish an equilibrium from a rates question? It comes down to the keywords in the question. Is the question mentioning yield, or is it mentioning rate? The explanations are completely different. So big piece of advice to high achievers: don't focus on singular mistakes. Try and identify categories or patterns of mistakes that will actually repeat.
So that leads us on to our final point of discussion today, Sachin, which is probably what most high achievers will really relate to in terms of what they've experienced, which is the pursuit of perfection, right? And the incessant pursuit of perfection, I should say. So just to elaborate a bit more on this, what I've commonly noticed, I'm guilty of this too, is focusing way too much on perfecting a specific topic and spending way too much time on that, and then running out of time to work on all the other things I need to do. Right? Yeah, exactly. So it might be, let's say, by example, I want to really perfect attenuation in the trip operon, right? That's something I want to make sure that I 100% am comfortable with before my SAC. But because I've spent so long working on that, I've neglected CRISPR-Cas9, I've neglected bioethics, and all those other topics have just fallen by the wayside. So it's really important as a high-achieving student to reflect on how much time do I have available before my SAC, before my end-of-year exam, and to plan ahead. These are the topics I need to cover. Have a clear structure. We touched on that in previous episodes as well. So, and use that structure to determine how much time do I have to cover this topic, right? And once you exceed that time, whatever you've done is what you've done. Move on to the next one, right? Because the priority is to ensure that you have a first pass coverage of all the topics that you can be assessed on, so that you have baseline understanding of everything. And then you go back and you think, okay, I understand this topic really well, but I'm a bit weaker on this, and then allocate some more time to those weak points. Because otherwise you run the risk of showing up to your SAC, you're an expert on the trip operon, and then as soon as you're faced with a CRISPR question, you don't know what to say because you haven't even learnt in the first place. So key thing for high performing students to appreciate and understand is that perfection is not something that you can achieve within just one sitting. It's likely not to be something you will achieve for a very long time, right? No one is perfect. You will always make mistakes. There will always be things that you don't know, right? So the aim is to get your understanding to a very high level that is decent enough to get you through the majority of the questions, then move on to the next topic. And once you've covered everything, come back and refine and tweak and get that extra percentage coverage.
So there you have it, the prominent mistakes that high achieving students make. Hopefully we've uncovered some blind spots for you and shown you some ways that we can change your study.
Keep an eye out on our Instagram and YouTube channel for more of these episodes dropping, and we hope you guys took away some value from today's episode. And we'll catch you all next time.